Hi everyone, live from New York City. I'm Stuart Macliver, co-founder and general partner of Amvest Terraden. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar presented by Amvest Capital and Amvest Terraden. Shortly, I'll be joined by my colleague Tomasz Nadrowski, who'll be walking us through today's topic, the hidden mineral toll of modern warfare, what the Iran conflict reveals about critical mineral supply chains. Before we dive in, quick disclaimer, this webinar is for informational purposes only and does not constitute an offer to sell or the solicitation of an offer to sell or buy any security. It should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. Our topic is an opaque one, so everything we reference today is drawn from publicly available sources, with some key sources listed here. In this presentation, we're going to try to unpack the mineral stockpiles that have been depleted in recent global conflicts and how defense procurement cycles could translate into market signals for our investment strategy. You'll see how important investing in these minerals are. Given how complex and layered this topic is, today's program is going to run a little bit longer than usual, so please give us patience and we thank you in advance. I want to say a quick word about who we are. So Amvest Capital Asset Management is the investment manager of the Amvest Terraden Critical Minerals Fund, which is a dedicated long-short hedge fund specializing in critical mineral equities. We seek to generate returns from investing in the critical mineral sector, which is a cornerstone of modern industry and innovation. We invest in companies involved in exploring, developing, mining strategic minerals, which are the essential building blocks for modern technologies, defense applications, and modern energy systems, including transportation, power generation, and storage. Importantly, we concentrate on supply chains independent of China, helping support a more secure and transparent future for these vital materials. We do want this webinar to be interactive, and we especially value questions from the audience. So please submit yours in the chat on the right side of your screen, and I'll try to ask them later in the program. We hope to have some time after Tomas's questions to get to your questions. So let me tell you a little about Tomasz. Tomasz Nadrowski is our portfolio manager and a seasoned expert in mining investments with over 25 years of global experience. His career includes such roles as portfolio manager, commodity strategist, commodity analyst, and he's worked all over the world. He is actually genuinely fluent in 7 languages, which makes him a great travel companion, but also means he carries the knowledge base and curiosity that you need to become an expert in critical minerals. Tomasz is a former director of the World Economic Forum, holds a CFA charter, and earned advanced degrees from the Geneva School of Economics and Management and the Geneva School of Social Sciences. And to this impressive list of achievements, he now adds the title of published author. Welcome, Tomasz.
Thank you, Stuart, and thanks everyone for joining us. It is a complex topic that we're going to treat today, as I think Stuart has forewarned you already. And one more disclaimer, we have no security clearance, so we're not dealing with any non-public information. Everything that's going to be presented here is public, and that public information sometimes is contradictory. So if you find any crass mistakes that you're aware of and the information is not classified, let us know. We would like to know more about it. Okay, so vulnerability or opportunity. We've been triggered and prompted to do this webinar following the initial stages of Epic Fury, the initial stages of the conflict with Iran in late February, early March. And that mostly because 2 organizations, CSIS and Royal United Services Institute, provided very interesting data about what happened to the different platforms used during the kinetic phase of that conflict at that time. These points are actually quite similar. They mostly overlap. And the most interesting element, of course, is the missiles. And we focus today on the missiles. Now, what I mean by missiles, I mean mostly standoff strike devices, interceptors, as well as sensor and command layer, including radars and so on, that are associated with those platforms. Now, of course, there were other platforms that were also affected, destroyed, or damaged during this conflict, or the most intense phase of this conflict, including an AWACS plane, several jets, and of course, there was a human toll as well. But we focus on missiles because the volumetric importance of those losses. Now, the war has been mostly prosecuted in a similar way to Desert Storm 35 years ago. But during Desert Storm, we no longer faced a strategic adversary. We currently do, and that adversary is not in the theater in which these missiles and this arsenal has been expanded in the last several months. So it's important to pay attention to this, to the cost exchange ratio of mostly low density platforms with very, very long qualification cycles if certain materials have to be procured from a different source. And unfortunately, they have to be procured from a different source because as we move upstream from that research by CSIS, RUSI, we're finding some uncomfortable truths about the availability of the materials that should go into the production to replace the expanded material or even an expanded production rate going forward. And this is an important signal for an investor because when restocking takes place, restocking for these materials upstream has to be done sort of front run, way ahead of everything else. And there is no denying that the commercial rationale will be secondary. What does it mean? It means that essentially defense procurement parties will bid up the prices for whatever is of limited availability. And that's something that investors should pay attention to. So we're going to look a little bit upstream from there, but to do this, we have several concerns. The first concern is the procurement process, which in the United States takes many months, sometimes years, between the original budget request and the appropriation. It depends on the budget cycle, and then a very long process within the agencies dealing with this, including the request for proposals, the technical evaluation, and so on. That can spread between several to many months, even 2 years, depending on the platform. That's concerning, and this is one of the reasons why current administration is trying to kind of leapfrog some of these stages, and also several companies have announced significant expansion of production. Lockheed, I think, spoke about $35 billion increased investment. That will be important, for example, for terminal high altitude area defense, the THAAD system, of which only about less than 100 have been produced per year. Well, apparently there will be about 4 times as many going forward. Similar numbers have been provided for Patriot interceptors, Tomahawk strike devices, and so on. We're going to go through some of those in some detail. Why is qualification period so long if we are to find other sources of the materials that go into this process? Well, mostly because defense products have to be CBRN tested. So they have to be resistant to chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear impact, meaning had to absorb it, block it, or neutralize it. So it's extremely long process. But it's also a process that's long in other supply chains, not necessarily defense, and semiconductors come here to mind immediately. The second problem that we're facing is the legacy of strategic negligence. Here on this slide, you'll find out that until 2024, a large number of significant materials that go into defense applications were sourced from our chief adversary, between 50, 70, sometimes 100%, depending on the type of material. That is negligence, and you'll find later in this presentation that our chief strategic adversary does not look at these things with a similar sort of lenient approach. In fact, in one particular case that I'll illustrate later, where the United States is the main source of that particular critical mineral, China has done its utmost to avoid US as a source of this material because of its importance for defense. The third source of concern is the mobilization of most of these critical minerals. Here is a list of 13, each of which is controlled by China by 55 or more %, some of them almost entirely monopolized. 5 of them are actually obtained through processing rather than directly through mining, because they're sort of minor byproducts of a major product for which the mines operate. And very often these smelters and refiners do not offer any payability for those byproducts. In fact, if it ends up in the Chinese sink, there is no money that returns to the producer of those byproducts upstream, even in the West. And the fourth area is weaponization of that monopoly, because monopoly in itself is not a problem. I worked many years at a South African company. South Africa has been a monopoly or near monopoly in terms of platinum production. It has never been a problem for catalytic converters for decades. The problem starts when monopoly is weaponized. And we have only one other case like this historically, and that's, of course, the 1973 oil embargo, where a near monopoly in oil shut off the Western world from access to oil. Now, my good friend Tom Marenhood from Columbia University compares the two cases, the Chinese weaponization of this monopoly and the embargo, oil embargo in 73, in a very astute way. He says that while the oil embargo was a car crash, this weaponization is more like colon cancer. And so this list here is a list of various restrictions. We spoke about it on other occasions. The only problem that I have with this slide is that it gets extended every time I speak to it. We had to add a new line at the bottom, giving China's near embargo on heavy rare earths and tungsten affecting Japan at the moment, a very vital ally of the United States. Okay, we're going to focus specifically today on something else. If you want to hear more about how China got here, how we got here, then just grab that recent book that Stuart mentioned, Mineral War, China's Quest for Weapons of Mineral Destruction. But today we're focusing on missiles. And so just briefly, assuming that maybe some of you do not know exactly how to categorize different types, it's important to mention what are different classes of materials, because they also call for slightly different materials, different minerals. So essentially, you can dissociate between ballistic and cruise missiles, and then interceptors that try to stop and dismantle or destroy ballistic threat or a cruise threat. And we'll refer to about 7 different platforms used by the United States and used and expanded highly during Epic Fury, and what it means for different materials that go into those different devices. Just very briefly, so how to understand that? So ballistic missiles, many of them exit atmosphere and have 3 kind of different phases: the boost phase, the mid-range, and then the terminal phase. In terminal phase, they mostly fall by gravity. They are usually faster than cruise missiles, who kind of hug the terrain and remain within the atmosphere. They also have a heavier payload, and they have like predetermined arc, as you see here. They can also be spotted by a radar for the interceptor much earlier, but they're faster. The cruise missiles usually are a little slower. They have sort of dynamic targeting. In a way, they're kind of like small planes with pop-out wings and fins. They are spotted also much later because of their sort of terrain-hugging trajectory. And there are hypersonic devices. Russia has one in its own arsenal in active duty, and China and North Korea are working hard on their own platforms, as is, by the way, India, France, and the United States. So quite a different and different also role of interceptors in terms of stopping them, and it has an impact on what goes into those devices. We've been in this world since the Second World War, actually. Both the ballistic and cruise missiles were invented by Nazi Germany. Ballistic missile was V2 in 1942, and the cruise missile V1 in 1944 entered into action. But back then, the materials that went to it, this was a very kind of limited range. Of course, steel was in it, aluminum, chromium, nickel, manganese, tantalum in V2, but also cobalt. And so you may ask yourself, well, how did Nazi Germany obtain cobalt? Well, they tried to obtain it from Belgium, because Belgium owned Congo. However, when Nazi Germany overran Belgium, the Congolese administration, the Belgian Congolese administration, pledged its allegiance to the exiled government in London, as many of those countries overrun by Nazi Germany had their exile government in exiles in London. And this was one source of chokehold. There was a chokehold. Nazi Germany could not easily obtain cobalt because the Belgian administration in Congo cooperated with the Allies. So, plus ça change, plus ça revient au même. All right, this is just to understand what we're going to talk about in detail when you look under the hood Of course, a missile doesn't have a hood, but it has an airframe, and airframe plays a lot of important roles, not only aerodynamic, but also for electromagnetic warfare, stealth, and so on. Guidance, that involves a lot of different things: inertial navigation systems, infrared seeking, GPS, and so on. Warheads, well, not all missiles have warheads. Some interceptors do not have warheads. They hold sort of kill vehicles that are structured differently. But what's important is what the warhead is cased in, what the structural pieces are. Controls are mostly those fins and tails. You will see many times over that sintered magnets are an important element of those controls because of actuators that go into this. And finally, engine in itself, the structural building blocks of the engine and the propulsion. And it may be surprising for some of you that certain metals are fuel additives in the propulsion systems. There's a difference between offensive structures because of different operational objectives. Offensive devices should have a long range, heavy payload, and precision. The defensive interceptors mostly rely on precision and speed. Okay, so let's start with the first one, a Tomahawk by RTX or Raytheon. A large, not so new device, actually invented in early 80s, so similar to sintered magnets, by the way. Early 80s give us more than funny hairstyles and plastic music. It turns out that survived many generations. It's being used very profusely during Epic Fury. Estimates range about 850 to 1,000 used up, but only about less than 200 are produced per year. Now, we hear about our Raytheon's ambition to boost it by a factor of 5, roughly, in different operations from Arizona to Alabama. The airframe, what goes into this, mostly titanium, aluminum, vanadium, an important alloy. The sort of penetrating nose is reinforced with tungsten. It shouldn't be surprising. This is an element with the second highest melting point after carbon. We have stainless steel there, and also it's referred to as CFRP. These are carbon fiber reinforced polymers. And now, what is the carbon? Carbon is graphite here, but I have a sort of disappointing message for all the graphite miners out there. This is mostly synthetic graphite. 70% of that material is graphite, but it's from coal-based organic precursors, which align different carbon atoms to a slightly bound matrix. And so that is kind of the story of the airframe. In addition, some cadmium, sometimes added for corrosion resistance. Another important element is TERCOM. TERCOM is terrain contour matching. That includes a lot of things we'll meet on a number of occasions going forward. There are radar altimeters there that include a semiconductor, gallium arsenide, semiconductor which being largely replaced by gallium nitride, as you see later on, and the inertial navigation system with some aluminum and copper. There's, of course, a lot of wiring, so you'll find silver there, tantalum-based capacitors, and germanium for infrared targeting. More on this in a second. The controls, of course, will require a lot of magnets, and the predominant sort of workhorse of these engines that you see going forward is samarium cobalt magnet, very well performing with high coercivity and difficult to demagnetize in high temperatures. The warhead itself has molybdenum coatings, again, important for heat resistance, but going forward, you find out that tungsten is probably more often used than molybdenum and molybdenum's alloys. And the engine, that depends on the part. So the compressor for air inflow is made of titanium. The combustor, of course, here temperature would be too high for titanium, so it's different alloys, cobalt alloys with chromium and tungsten, and sometimes nickel alloys with iron, molybdenum, and chromium. And then the nozzle booster that transforms thermal energy into kinetic energy is made of graphenol, which is another graphite-based material, but it's again mostly synthetic graphite. And the propellant, this is mostly ammonium perchlorate, but an important additive to this is aluminum powder. Aluminum powder or boron powder are used depending on the type of engine that's used. By the way, the engines themselves for those endo-atmospheric cruise missiles is usually a jet engine, so it breathes air, whereas for something that exits atmosphere, it's a rocket engine with an oxidizer. Okay, so let's get it out of the way immediately, because we mentioned already rare earths. In the case of samarium, there's so much misconception about rare earths and the use of rare earths in defense applications, so we thought maybe we'll just clear it out immediately. First of all, a Tomahawk uses between 2.5 to 4 kilograms of rare earths. Even say stealth jet fighter like F-35 that sometimes you see in junior miners presentations with hundreds of kilograms of rare earths going into it. That's not true. That's maybe about 21 kilograms, including mostly those samarium cobalt magnets, as well as yttrium stabilized zirconia for thermal coating of some engine parts. However, that doesn't mean that these materials are irrelevant, because the volumes are not exactly what people would dream of. In fact, there is a disconnect between the pricing of these materials. Samarium oxide is a great example. Selling in China at less than $3 per kilogram, and the largest user for defense, U.S. defense, requires maybe 50 tons of this per year. So of course you cannot build a mine on top of that sort of product of multiplication. Now, two things are going to change. And of course, there's going to be a big growth in demand from defense going forward if all of these promises of major increase and quintupling, quadrupling of the capacity, the productive capacity really are realized, number one. And number two, we've seen already, say in Europe, a 3 times a tripling of the demand for defense for those magnets between the first Ukrainian war and the second Ukrainian war, which is ongoing. So that's important, because if, say, that particular defense procurement company uses maybe 3 or 4% right now of a 1,300-ton samarium market around the world, and it triples or quadruples, suddenly it becomes important. So I wouldn't completely dismiss it. Where is the problem with rare earths in the West? It used to be for a long time oxide separation. I think the onus is moving towards metallization, so transforming those separate oxides, such as samarium, into the actual metal, so that it goes into an alloy, that it goes into a magnet. The different solutions to this problem, U.S. companies have focused mostly on consolidating vertically along the value chain. The very recent examples are Energy Fuels acquiring ASM in Australia, which owns a Korean metallization plant in Korea, of course, and USA Rare Earths acquiring Less Common Metals in Britain, another metallization specialist with many other metal product lines as well. Japanese solution is different. Shin-Etsu, which is probably the most commercially astute firm in this entire rare earth space in the West or outside China, is building a new capacity in Fukui Prefecture, and Mitsui Kinzaku, so Mitsui Metal, is also building a center in Fukuoka, both for separation and metallization. So there's some movement here. As I mentioned, the samarium cobalt magnet, we'll see it later on many other platforms. I'm not going to go back to it. Very heat resistant for actuators that it sort of prompts, and that's important for all these flight surfaces and fins and so on. It also performs very well regardless of temperature, even in very low temperature to absolute zero. Important if you move to, say, lower orbit, where we're between negative 150 degrees Celsius and positive 120, depending whether in shade or in sunlight. But it's also more resistant to cosmic radiation than sort of more commonly used in civilian applications, so neodymium iron boron magnets, even if they are doped with dysprosium, which is difficult to obtain as well. The second material that I mentioned on occasion of Tomahawk is germanium. So germanium is a small market, 130 tons per annum only, but it's an expensive material. Why is it so important for defense applications? Because it's a good infrared seeker. Why do we need infrared? Because we need to see despite bad weather or darkness or through the smoke or through dust. And that's what those thermal signatures allow us to do, but you need something that would capture that. It's a passive detection device, a material, operating between about 3 microns and 15 microns, so sort of mid and longer wavelength of infrared, and I'll explain this why it's important in a moment. It's usually a byproduct of zinc production from various sources, mesothermal, polymetallic veins, such as in Peru, in Yukon, Coeur d'Alene historically as well. All high sulfidation epithermals that we have in many places, Bolivia, even in Europe. But interestingly enough, China has actually one operating mine that operates specifically for germanium, and it's not a mesothermal or epithermal high sulfidation system. It's actually a coal seam associated with some siliceous limestones. Mine is called Linzang in Yunnan in the south of the country. From this tiny germanium market, let's move to cobalt. Cobalt, that's much larger, 310 kilotons per annum. But here what's interesting is that 1/4 of superalloys made of cobalt already go into defense. So it's not a new story. Now, the DOW last year decided to actually run a tender for 7,500 tons of alloy grade cobalt. And we had a bit of a kerfuffle there. I mean, they reached out to the only non-Chinese, or just about only non-Chinese smelters and refiners that would produce cobalt, one in Norway, one in Canada, both operated by Glencore, one in Japan, operated by Sumitomo. What DOW actually wanted was a 5-year flat price contract. It just happened that in the middle of that, DRC and PRC went into a conflict over what the formerly known China Moly produces through a variety of copper cobalt deposits in the Congo, paying very, very low royalties because overproducing the material alongside other Chinese-dominated operators that produce cobalt as a byproduct of nickel production in Indonesia. And so Kinshasa put an embargo on exports. Cobalt prices rocketed from $16 to, I think, $25 per $1,000 per ton, and therefore that sort of program of purchasing that at flat price was just unacceptable to the potential providers. How it's solved, I'm not sure it's solved. And hitherto unknown company, Virtus Materials, recently, U.S. company, purchased Dubai-based Shemaf's deposits in the Congo, which are cobalt heavy. One of them is Etoile mine that's been running since 1907. Another one is the developing asset. Shemaf had about $900 million worth of debt, of which 200 were unsecured. So the price for that ticket was about 30 million. We'll see how that evolves. Overall, cobalt is hardly ever really mined as a primary source of mines value. That's the case of Bouazer mine in Morocco, but there's a variety of different either sediment-hosted stratiform copper deposits in, say, Katanga, or magmatic sulfide deposits in the northern hemisphere, as well as lateritic deposits with nickel as a main product in Southwest Pacific. And titanium, we're talking here about titanium sponge and titanium metal, so about 400 kilotons of material, as opposed to the broader titanium dioxide market is about 9 million tons, including what goes into pigment. We're interested only in the metal production. The metal production, always complicated, is a very difficult material to machine. It has low thermal conductivity, it also very conductive, very interactive or reactive when molten. So it's complicated. Once you lose your institutional memory how to work that, it's difficult to get it back. Titanium was important first Cold War. It is important in the Second Cold War as well. Where are the sources? Well, Rio Tinto is an important source, mostly through their Havre Saint-Pierre mine in Quebec and the associated smelter. so a Tracy smelter. Rio Tinto also has production from heavy mineral sands in Richards Bay in southern Africa that qualifies for metal production. And Iluka, which used to serve mostly titanium dioxide for pigment in China, has also seen the light of the day and is redirecting production from just Ambrosia mine into metal. And we recently, with Stuart, we visited new project in Malawi called Kasia, owned by Sovereign Metals, which is also now being qualified by Japanese metal producers as potentially source of titanium sponge. Why Japanese? Because Osaka Titanium and Toho Titanium are the most important producers of the metal, in addition to Allegheny in the US and some smaller companies. Geologically, you find it either in those sedimentary heavy minerals sands or through magmatic vanadium, titanium, or magnetic VTM deposits. But there is one interesting freak deposit in Western Australia, which is actually a massive sedimentary deposit called Pitfield, operated by Empire Metals. In terms of a process, this has been used for a long time, the Kroll chlorine process, although Hyperion X, as most of us know, has come up with a very interesting bypass, which is less footprint, less environmental damage. This is a hydrogen-assisted metallothermic reduction process that's hopefully it's going to take the titanium metal production forward. The second type of missiles is JASSMs, so Joint Air Surface Standoff missile systems. Standoff meaning you're beyond the horizon. You can hit your enemy and they cannot reach you back. This missile is launched from aircraft, and we used about 1,000 of those. And here there is a discrepancy between different sources of information, how much we have left in the inventory, between 1,000 or 4,000 something. Regardless, the production is only 500 per annum, and it contains a few kilograms of critical minerals. So it's an important long-range cruise missile. It's a little younger design than Tomahawk, so it's a baby of 1990s. So what is this, grunge music? And that means stealth, right? Stealth. Stealth means that there are sort of rudder-absorbing materials here, and those rudder-absorbing materials reduce your sort of magnetic signature. So what it does is that basically absorbs radio frequency and transforms it to heat mostly. The matrix is made from non-conductive materials, and then there are some conductive materials that are thrown into it, the most important of which is carbonyl iron. So iron made of pentacarbonyl, and then all of this sort of bathing in a polymer. But there are also dielectric elements that go into this, such as silicon dioxide, which those who listened to our semiconductor presentation a while ago seen before. Then in terms of targeting, beryllium is important in alloy with aluminum. I'll talk about beryllium in a moment. Guidance, you'll find here germanium and sapphire that does more or less the same thing as germanium, except it's much harder and a stronger material. And there's a variety of other infrared seekers here that I also speak about a little later. The controls shouldn't surprise you. This is mostly rare earths. And the warhead here, as I warned before, comes with tungsten, or rather tungsten, nickel iron alloy, which is very, very tungsten heavy. And the engine, so the engine uses superalloys, niobium superalloys, for example, that can withstand 1200 Celsius. And if you want this projectile to go into, say, 1600, then you need some refractory alloys such as tungsten, molybdenum with tantalum. Okay, beryllium. I promised that I say something about beryllium. So beryllium is this world upside down, where US is the main source of the material and China is short beryllium. It's for real-time imagery equipment, so mostly those electro-optical targeting systems, inertial guidance systems, and so on. Why is that? Because of the super stability that they offer in sort of gyro stabilizing platforms, for example, in gimbals. So why beryllium? Well, it offers low thermal expansion, so it doesn't really warp easily or distort, even if the missile heats up, and it is extremely stiff. So it doesn't really take vibration very easy. So it's very good to actually in case a lot of those optical elements that are there for optical infrared elements that are there for guidance. And so the main source of this is a company called Materion in the US, with a mine, Spore Mountain, in Utah, and downstream operations in Utah and in Ohio. This is a carbonatite deposit, quite unique actually. There are peralkaline deposits in some other places, and historically felsic pegmatites were used for this, not least in Russia, in Buryatia, which during the Soviet times fed an important Kazakh plant. That plant continued to operate after the collapse of the Soviet Union, of the inventory of the material brought from Buryatia, from Russia, and China has always relied on Kazakhstan, never on the United States, to purchase this material. So a little bit less of negligence there. Now, what happens now that Kazakhstan has run out of that historic Russian inventory? Kazakhstan signed a deal with Rwanda, because similar felsic pegmatites are available in Africa, not only in Russia. Okay, now boron. So why boron? Boron is this alternative to aluminum in terms of the fuel additives to certain types of engines. These are essentially high-density slurry flow fluids with very, very high energy density, and so they offer more thrust, right? So more sort of higher heat and combustion. Boron is, the production is actually controlled almost from predominantly one important mine, evaporitic borate deposit in Turkey called Kirka. And there are several others like this. Boron is also present with lithium in the sedimentary deposits. Rhyolite Ridge in Nevada is one of those, and Jadar in Serbia is another one, but neither of which is currently producing. One in development, the other one stuck in politics. And then also geothermal brines in such beautiful places in New Zealand, Iceland, and Salton Sea offer a source of boron. Sorry, gone too far. All right, we're moving to the first ballistic missile, still a strike offensive weapon. It's called PRSM, so precision the weapon. So it's a tactical weapon made by Lockheed, replaces ATACMS. You may have heard of ATACMS at the beginning of Ukrainian war. This precision strike missile has better range and is better at anti-jamming. It's endo-atmospheric ballistic, launched from the ground, relatively short range, although the most recent versions are sort of a mid-range. It has an airframe that would be familiar to you by now, titanium and cobalt. The guidance is dual mode. So the guidance is both in the radio frequencies and infrared. So the active sort of transmitter and receiver is made of gallium nitride. Then the midwave sensor is from indium antimonide. And then you have this tunable infrared sensor made for dual alloy. So it's an alloy of mercury telluride and cadmium telluride, and depending on the proportions between the two, can actually capture longer or more mid level wave of infrared spectrum. And then beryllium that I mentioned just now is also present here in gimbals and gyro stabilizers. The controls, again, with rare earths. The warhead is definitely dependent on tungsten, so par excellence. Defense metal, about 12% of demand for tungsten goes into defense. And the engine itself, depending on carbon fiber, various super alloys as well. And interesting enough, the propellant here is aluminum again, and not why not boron? In some type of engine structure, boron can leave this kind of glassy boron trioxide, especially if it's turbine blades. So in jet engines, it's less likely to see boron. It's more likely to see it in rocket engines that do not have those blades, and it's because it's difficult to evacuate it. Now, aluminum trioxide that's created there, it's more easy to just throw out of the nozzle. Let us focus on tungsten for a moment. Very much in the news right now, given the Chinese embargo on tungsten exports to Japan. That mostly is an attack on the Western semiconductor supply chain, because that means that the main Japanese companies, Central Glass and Kanto Kogyo Denka, are not allowed to produce tungsten hexafluoride, which is essential for etching and creation of through silicon vias deep into the structure of semiconductors, especially damaging for memory chips. For our purposes today, tungsten is important as a kinetic energy penetrator and rocket stabilizer. Now, there is an estimate that Epic Fury used about 4 tons of tungsten in its ammo overall. Don't know how reliable that is. Do we have a problem given that China controls 85% of this? Yes, we do, but we have a replacement material, and that's called depleted uranium, 0.3% uranium-235. We have 750 kilotons of that, and there are some, environmental and political problems to actually use it for weapon production. But it's actually harder, 1.7 times harder than tungsten itself. And what it does on impact actually sharpens rather than becoming sort of a mushroom like tungsten does. Both precision strike, so prisms and JESMs, they have warheads made of tungsten. The JESM's warhead is much larger. This is this alloy with nickel and iron. Where is tungsten sourced originally? Well, it's often said that China is the Saudi Arabia of rare earths. I tend to say it's the Saudi Arabia of tungsten rather than rare earths because of its geological endowment. It really, until recently, didn't need to import any tungsten feedstock. They may be changing now, who knows? But there are 3 different types of geology that you find in Jiangnan Belt and aside. So both there's porphyry, there's skarns, and there's greisen, which is a hydrothermally altered granite. This type of granite-hosted deposit also exists in Myanmar, in Bolivia. We recently saw one in Portugal. Skarn deposits are those that are attracting probably most attention right now because Almonty produces now some material from South Korea. EQ Resources in Queensland. Group 6 is developing something on King Island, tiny island between Tasmania and mainland Australia. So there is hope here in terms of mining, and there are some other deposits in Northwest Territory. Turkey and other places. Gallium. So gallium is a different story because I mentioned this twice already, gallium nitride and gallium arsenide. Small market, 760 tons per annum, of which about half, 320, are high purity gallium that's of interest to us today. Now, 3 companies dominate production. One is Chinalco, the second largest aluminum producer in China. One is Dongfang Xiuan, East Hope, all right, in China as well, and Guangdong Fangyuan, which was, I think, 6 different plants around China. Why has China become so important? Because the West and everybody was sending bauxite to Chinese alumina refineries without being paid for gallium at all. Kunin Technologies recently calculated that $10 billion have been given away this way to the PRC. So it's time for this to change. China has an alumina refinery overcapacity, about 25% overcapacity, as it has in zinc as well, putting recently some of zinc smelters idle. So there's maybe a moment to actually reduce that dependency by thinking about some differential payabilities for this very important material. How are we doing in the West? Well, not great yet. Żarnowica is one operator using recycled material from gallium phosphide and gallium antimonite in Slovakia. The DOE and DOW have done several moves. There is a grant by DOE to 5 different companies in US to look at extraction of about 1 ton from various waste streams, and this is Atalco, Indium Corporation, Kuning Technologies, and 2 others. Korea Zinc investment in Tennessee, supported by about $1.9 billion of taxpayers' money. That potentially could help us with gallium. Why? Because gallium does not necessarily have to be a byproduct of alumina. It's also a byproduct of zinc, ferrite or zinc slag. It's enough to leach it, solvent extract or ion exchange, and then electro-win it. And then there is the program for Element USA, about $30 million, I think, by DOW to reuse about 30 million tons of bauxite residue for gallium extraction. Japan also has its programs with Mitsubishi Corporation importing feedstock from Kazakhstan, and also they have a cooperation with Alcoa in Australia. But the payability problem, and this is actually taken from Kunin Technologies, very interesting presentation showing that many of these materials that we mentioned, of course, are not directly mined, and they are lost because they are not paid for by the smelters. And there's the case of cadmium, tellurium, scandium, gallium, germanium, you name it. And even in larger ones, which are not here, payability is sometimes low. Think about cobalt, right? Cobalt might get between 45 and 85% payability from a nickel operation, but from a copper operation, it's less, 45 and sometimes zero, is considered a deleterious material, believe it or not. But it's possible to actually think about those waste streams. Copper anode slimes are a good source of, say, selenium and tellurium. All we need to do is just to roast it and leach it in first the tellurium and then selenium. All right, we're moving to the second category of missiles. These are the interceptors. The interceptors have slightly different things to think about. They have to actually find something very fast and react fast and be quite maneuverable in this. So let me just use this slide to think about our senses, our faculties, so our eyes and our ears, so that it's sort of better understandable. So infrared imagining, all of these semiconductors you see here, this is the retina of our eye, right? This is something that will be responsive to different wavelengths of infrared, between something that's close to visual spectrum and something that's all the way towards almost cosmic, cool, very far, very long wave infrared. Optical housing, this is the cornea of our eye. So the sapphire and germanium I mentioned, also zinc sulfide, interestingly enough, which is to create those optical domes and windows around it. And zinc sulfide has actually very wide band gap. I skip radar and move to solid lubricants. These are the tears over our eyes. This is important for coating. So it's made from TMDs. What are TMDs? Transition metal dichalcogenides. What are dichalcogenides? The group 16 at the table of elements that includes selenium, tellurium, sulfur, also oxygen, although oxygen is not part of this TMD story. And so products such as molybdenum disulfide or tungsten disulfide are used to cover those optical sensors, infrared sensors, with coatings that are solid, not fluid. Why not fluid? Why not liquid? Well, because they would melt simply passing through atmosphere, for example, or at very extreme temperature changes. And radar, of course, you're familiar with that. It's more like our ears or our voice that we use in a big cavern or in the mountains and hearing the echoes of that coming back to us. So gallium nitride, extremely important for amplifiers, transmitter, receivers. So admits actively either microwave or millimeter wide wave, and then sort of waits for the echoes to detect something without overheating. The second compound here, it's yttrium, iron garnet. So yttrium being a non-lanthanide rare earth element. This is for filters and oscillators, very important in electromagnetic warfare and jamming of communications and radars. One interesting feature of this is that there are like valves going one way. So you can send the signals and it doesn't ricochet back to you or allied platforms to sort of create some additional noise. And then the one below, the YGG, it's yttrium gadolinium garnet, so includes another rare earth element, gadolinium. That's for radio frequency circulators and phase shifters that so they kind of horizontally move the wave without changing the amplitude of this, and can function at a much higher power level than the previous one. And the thermal barrier for many of these interceptors, actually all of those that I looked into, use this yttrium stabilized zirconia for coating. So that you're not too confused about this, I decided to just show you a little bit how these different elements, these different critical elements actually are, what do they actually do, and in which part of a spectrum. So most of the spectrum of interest is infrared. Some of this is close to visible spectrum, say LiDAR would be like this, so light detection range, rangefinders. Some of this are closer to the sort of micro and radio wave. You'll find here so gadolinium is the one that I wanted just to say one more thing about. This is a very important rare earth element. I think underestimated and currently not really separated or produced in any large scale outside of China. Although I heard something to the contrary in Japan recently, although I don't know to what extent this is commercial knowledge. Anyway, what is gadolinium about? It interacts with electromagnetic waves and manipulates those signals in a way that's really important for jamming. It's in electromagnetic interference shielding, because this material is used to dope some of those TMDs, transition metal dichalcogenides, such as molybdenum disulfide. Then it's used to reduce graphene oxide, and that's an extremely good material with high dielectric loss tangent. So this transmission of the electromagnetic wave into heat. And gadolinium is found both in ESM and ECM, so electric support measures, which are basically detection of the so for threat awareness, and then ECM, which is electric countermeasures, which means deceiving, spoofing, and jamming the enemy's platform. So here are the pair of two interceptors. They're actually quite different. SM3 is to intercept ballistic missiles outside of the atmosphere. It has sort of exo-atmospheric kill vehicle, and SM6 is a multi-mission, slightly different multi-mission interceptor for ballistic, for cruise, and even for aircraft. What we find here is that, I tried to dissociate between SM6 and SM3, like slightly different airframe, given that one of them actually has to exit atmosphere. Guidance also, slight differences here, but you're now familiar with most of these different compounds. Controls, we've also seen it before. It's in the engine that there's some interest, especially in SM6. You'll see in lithium for the first time. Now, this is lithium for lithium thermal batteries. Lithium thermal batteries, not lithium ion batteries. What's the difference? These are lithium silicon batteries with solid, inert salts that are only getting ignited during the eventual usage of this, so the electrolyte gets melted. The cathode, again, another transition metal dichalcogenide. It's iron disulfide. And why not lithium-ion batteries? Think about it. These things actually stay in a silo, sometimes for 10, 20 years before their final suicide mission. What would happen to the lithium-ion battery? Well, it would discharge, right? It would basically degrade itself. So it's not an option here. Now, lithium itself, it's questionable. Is it a critical mineral or not? I think if we were to look at submarine technology, I'm sure we would count it as a critical mineral, but it's a large market now, 1.1 million ton, sourced mostly from lithium aluminum silicates hidden in those dikes, pegmatitic dikes from Western Australia to James Bay in Quebec, from Western Central Africa to Portugal and Iran. Of course, there are evaporitic deposits, salt pans and salars in the Andes and in Tibet, condensed clay deposits such as Thacker Pass in Nevada, geothermal sources, Salton Sea, or the one in Germany developed by Vulcan Energy, and then oil fields, residues, Smackover in Arkansas and across the southern part of the United States and potentially Saudi Arabia. But the problem is conversion of spodumene, which is, of course, controlled by China. I didn't mention, but I should have, when we looked at those standard missiles, 6 and 3 especially, is that alloy of rhenium, alloy with molybdenum and tungsten, is extremely important. Actually, it's found also in F-22 and F-35. Why is that? It's in thrusters of interceptors because it allows for very precise maneuvering, and there's no need for active cooling because it can actually withstand extremely high temperatures. I mean, really, the ranges from almost negative 200 degrees to 1900 positive. So it's found in those divert and attitude control systems, for example, in those exo-atmospheric kill vehicles that detach from those missiles to then look for and maneuver to hit the incoming target. And thanks to that, the presence of rhenium, these engines can run much, much hotter without additional cooling material, whether cryogenic or thermoelectric. Where is it sourced from? So historically, US sourced it from Chile because it is usually a byproduct of molybdenum, which itself is a byproduct of copper often. But there are other sources, mountain. So the mine in Montana would be one, and our ally Poland has significant deposits in its own copper mineralization. That's of course controlled partly by a state-owned company, but recently a new Canadian company launched by a very well-known Canadian mining entrepreneur has gone public with access to 3 different deposits, some of which are uranium rich. Uranium is known only since 1990, so it was not the story of the first desert storm. Was found on Etorofu, so a Japanese island that's still occupied by Russia to this day. Okay, how do they differ? Well, of course, they differ because the SM3 and SM6, because of the nature of their flight path and the necessity of different measurements. I'll skip this, otherwise we're gonna get stuck. But niobium matters there in the alloys, super alloys. Most of niobium is found in carbonatites, secondary carbonatites, sometimes with supergene like Araxá in Brazil. Some big hopes laid on West Arunta, operated by WA1 in Western Australia. There's also Tomtar in Saka, Siberia, not really very prospective, and Saint-Honoré in Quebec. But also peralkaline, intrusive peralkaline deposits, all of them complicated. Southern Greenland, Luvozero on Kola Peninsula, Dabo in Southern Australia, and Nova Skär in Sweden that just got a 25-year permit from the Swedish government to operate, mostly because of its rare earth presence, rare earths in the deposit. Okay, last 2. The first one is THAAD, so Terminal High Altitude Area Defense by Lockheed. It operates in upper atmosphere, so it doesn't exit atmosphere, but still has a kill vehicle, this detachable kill vehicle, rather than a warhead. We already used about 25% of that inventory last year during the 12-day war with Iran, firing about 150. And this year has been absolutely catastrophic for this use, not only because of the interceptors, but because of the radar systems, of which there are 7 in the inventory overall US, at least this is what's known in public, and 3 of those were damaged or destroyed, 1 in Jordan and 2 in UAE. What happens then if this radar is not perfect, all this gallium nitride for nothing, then of course you have to send a lot more interceptors, and your cost to exchange ratio grows because your precision hits the wall rather than the oncoming threat. So what's important to say, I mean, most of the guidance is assured by indium antimonide, this infrared seeker that has a very quick response. It's very, very sensitive, so good for targeting oncoming threats in their terminal phase. They're sort of embedded in focal plane arrays in those missile warning systems. So just a word about antimony. We had a problem with kind of middle part of this value chain for a long time, and when an important endeavor was launched in Oman, it turned out that there was no feedstock. So there's 2 problems, one over another. In US antimony is expanding its midstream operation in Montana, but usually the antimony supply chain in the US has been kind of tied to lead recycling system, which is very robust. In terms of mining deposits, it's mostly sediment-hosted hydrothermal replacement deposits, such as the largest mine in the world in Hunan in China, also Sistan in Iran, Turkey, Alaska has some similar mineralization, but also some of them are metamorphic rock hosted hydrothermal replacement deposits, and we recently visited one in the Serbian Macedonian massif, the northern sort of western part of the Tetian belt. Carbonate-hosted deposits are found in Tajikistan, and of course, all gold investors would know that it's found with gold shear zones around the world quite commonly. And the final one is Patriot. So made famous during the Ukraine war. Ukraine used about 600 of those. By comparison, in Epic Fury, we used almost 1,400 in just 3 weeks. Lockheed is promising $9 billion to invest in that particular interceptor. There's a new Alabama plant being built. There are 2 different ones. There's PAC-2 and PAC-3. PAC-2 is essentially anti-cruise, and it's a Raytheon product with a warhead. PAC-3 has this hit-to-kill rather than a warhead structure, and it's anti-ballistic. One thing that's of interest here, strangely not in this slide, but should be, is bismuth telluride, which is a thermoelectric cooler. For some of these infrared seekers and detectors need to be cooled, and some of them are cooled with a superlattice of other semiconductors, indium, gallium arsenide, for example, and some require cryogenic structures. It's more complex with sort of vacuums and chambers and heat exchangers and so on. But bismuth telluride is a thermoelectric, sort of polarizes very easily between cold and hot sites, and prevents the overheating, prevents that thermal footprint of the machinery itself, sort of creates a sort of a path that's not necessarily focused perfectly on the target. For that, there are systems, for example, in PAC-3 that only kicking at the last moment to avoid, say, jamming by the oncoming threat. So one element here that comes back quite a lot, and I haven't mentioned this, is tantalum. Here it's found in avionics, generally electronics, for capacitors. I mean, it's a high dielectric constant material, so it can hold a lot of energy in a very small space. Space is important here, really at premium. So you find it both in THAAD systems and the PAC-3 systems for radar guidance, communications, power filtering, and so on. Now, you find this material in peralkaline deposit. I mentioned already Lavoisier from Kola or in Greenland, currently not being exploited. Enriched pegmatites, where it's commonly found today with mines that are mostly producing lithium, not least in Western Australia. Enriched granite in different parts of Northern Asia, and then coltan around Africa with columbite. So niobium and tantalum together. And I'm sure you heard about coltan before for other reasons. So sorry, I'm 1.5 minutes behind, but I think that's all we wanted to cover so far. Short or two.
Yeah, that was a fascinating in-depth presentation. So clearly we've gone, over the hour. So we'll just ask two questions. So you focus on missiles today. What other metals and compounds in defense applications should investors pay attention to?
Yeah, so I haven't mentioned terbium, for example, which is one of those two heavy rare earths. Terbium sometimes is replaceable with dysprosium as a dopant for neodymium iron boron magnet. So that's sort of that magnet that may require a lower temperature and less cosmic radiation. But it's also in terphenol D, which is an important magnetostrictive material for sonars in submarines. So today, of course, we didn't focus on that. Otherwise, definitely the direct energy weapons in development, such as those being developed currently by Israel. Some of them contain yttrium aluminum garnet laser. So there's some hope that the shield will be able to actually defend the sword sooner or later. There's so much active testing right now going on around the world that maybe this technology is really advancing. The same material, if it's doped with neodymium, it's useful for LiDAR. So light detection, range finding, so very close to sort of visual spectrum. Indium phosphide is another one in jamming, very important. Sort of can transform electricity into light and just make optical communications more less easily detectable by the enemy. But there are many others. We should pay attention to fluorspar. We should pay attention to erbium. We should pay attention to magnesium. Magnesium used to be an important, very important source of airframe building in early stages of missile technology in the 50s and 60s. Lost some of its importance ever since.
Yeah. And so on smelting and refining, how do you think the West fixes the payability problem there?
I don't know. Maybe that's an interesting one for governments to cooperate on. I mean, certainly there are companies that realize this. I mean, I presented this slide from Kuning Technologies. It's fascinating. The first thing I would do is just differential payability. So a different way to for those who still contract their feedstock with Chinese operators who have now suffered really from overcapacity. And so if they suffer from overcapacity, here's sorry, but you have to pay for for those minor metals, and then support those smelters that are trying to develop these value chains again, or redevelop them in the West in a different way. So some differential pricing, and so let's move some of the escalation away from the PRC towards our own devices and use the opportunities the market presents. There's definitely massive overcapacity across different major metal smelting and refining, and even right now they're building more smelters for copper. There's no need for that. Certainly not in their market.
Well, thanks for that. So as we conclude today's webinar, I want to thank each of you for your participation and engagement. A replay will be available in around an hour following the webinar. And if you submitted a question we didn't get to, then please reach out to us directly, and you can learn more about us at our website, amvestterraden.com. And thank you so much for that. Goodbye.
Thank you.